I still remember the exact moment I saw Daniel across that crowded coffee shop in downtown Portland. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in October, and I was running late for work, fumbling with my umbrella and laptop bag. He was sitting by the window, reading what looked like a worn paperback novel, completely absorbed. When he looked up and our eyes met, he smiled this gentle, almost shy smile that made my heart skip. He didn't approach me with some cheesy pickup line or overconfident swagger like other guys I'd met. Instead, he waited until I was ordering my usual vanilla latte and quietly offered to pay for it. When I protested, he just shrugged and said, "Consider it a welcome to the neighborhood gift. I've seen you here before, but never had the courage to say hello." His honesty was refreshing. We ended up talking for 2 hours. I called in sick to work for the first time in years, and I didn't feel guilty about it. Daniel was an elementary school teacher at Lincoln Elementary, and the way his face lit up when he talked about his students made me realize he genuinely cared about making a difference. He asked about my job at the marketing firm, but more importantly, he asked about my dreams, my family, what made me laugh. Most guys I dated only talked about themselves. Our first real date was the following Saturday at Laurelhurst Park. He packed sandwiches from this little deli on Hawthorne and brought a thermos of hot chocolate because he remembered I mentioned loving it. We walked around the pond, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in Salem with his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. I shared stories about my chaotic but loving family dinners with my 3 siblings. What struck me most was how he listened. Really listened. When I told him about my dad's recent heart surgery, his eyes filled with genuine concern. He didn't try to fix anything or offer empty reassurances. He just squeezed my hand and said, "That must be really scary for you." It was such a simple response, but it felt like he truly understood. The next few months flew by in a blur of weekend trips to the coast, lazy Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, and quiet evenings cooking dinner together in my tiny apartment. Daniel had this way of making ordinary moments feel special. He'd leave little notes in my coat pockets or send me texts in the middle of the day just to say he was thinking about me. Nothing dramatic or over the top, just thoughtful. My family adored him immediately. During our first Thanksgiving together, he spent the entire afternoon helping my mom in the kitchen, genuinely interested in learning her famous stuffing recipe. He played board games with my younger brother Jake and listened patiently to my sister Sarah's college drama. My dad, who was usually suspicious of any guy I brought home, pulled me aside and said, "This one's different, sweetheart. He's got good character." Daniel never rushed anything. He respected my boundaries, supported my goals, and made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. When I got promoted at work, he surprised me with a small celebration dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant on Alberta Street. When I was stressed about my best friend's wedding planning, he made me tea and rubbed my shoulders without being asked. The proposal came 8 months after we met, during one of our evening walks around the lake at Mount Tabor. The cherry blossoms were just starting to bloom, and the sunset painted everything in soft pink and gold. He didn't get down on one knee dramatically. Instead, he stopped walking, took my hands, and said, "Emma, you make me want to be the best version of myself every single day. I can't imagine my life without you in it." Then he pulled out this simple, beautiful ring that belonged to his grandmother. I said yes before he could even finish asking the question. We both cried and laughed at the same time, and I felt like my heart might burst from happiness. Everything about it felt right, like all the pieces of my life had finally fallen into place. Our wedding was small and perfect, held in my parents' backyard in suburban Beaverton. Daniel's few remaining relatives came down from Salem, and our friends filled the rest of the folding chairs. My dad walked me down the makeshift aisle, while my mom cried happy tears from the front row. Daniel's voice cracked when he said his vows, promising to love and protect me through everything life might bring. That night, as we slow danced to our first song as husband and wife, I looked around at all the people we loved celebrating with us. The string lights my sister had hung in the trees twinkled like stars, and I could hear my cousins laughing by the dessert table. Daniel whispered in my ear, "Mrs. Collins, are you ready for our adventure?" I had never been more ready for anything in my life. The first few months in our little rental house in southeast Portland felt like playing house in the best possible way. We painted the kitchen yellow together, arguing playfully about whether it was too bright. Daniel installed shelves for my books and didn't complain when I took over half the closet. We hosted dinner parties for our friends, and I loved watching him tell stories that made everyone laugh. We talked about everything. Kids, buying a real house someday, maybe getting a dog. Daniel wanted to move up to a principal position eventually, and I was considering freelancing so I could work from home when we started our family. Sunday mornings became our sacred time, reading the paper in bed with coffee and splitting the crossword puzzle. These ordinary moments felt precious. I should have noticed the changes earlier, but they crept in so gradually. Daniel started staying later at school, saying he had more paperwork than usual. When he came home, he seemed tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The easy conversations became shorter, more surface level. He still kissed me goodbye each morning, but it felt automatic, like checking an item off a list. The drinking started innocently enough. A beer with dinner became 2 beers. Friday night wine became nightly wine. When I mentioned it casually, he laughed it off. It's been a rough semester, Em. These kids are more challenging than usual. I believed him because I wanted to. Teachers do have stressful jobs, and Daniel had always been someone who internalized pressure. But then came that night in February. The rain was coming down hard, drumming against our windows like angry fingers. Daniel had been drinking since he got home from work, sitting in his chair with a bottle of whiskey I didn't even know we had. I'd made his favorite dinner, pot roast with vegetables, but he barely touched it. I was doing dishes when he asked for another drink. His words were already slurring together, and I could see that glassy look in his eyes that had become too familiar. Maybe you should eat something first, I suggested gently, the way I'd learned to speak when he got like this. You didn't have much dinner. That's when he asked for the bottle. Not a glass, the whole bottle. I hesitated, my hands still wet from the dishwater, and something in my expression must have triggered something in him. Are you my wife or my mother? He snapped, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. I'm just worried about you, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. You've been drinking more lately, and I think maybe we should talk about it. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor, a sound that made my stomach clench. Talk about what? About how my own wife doesn't trust me to have a drink in my own house? His face was flushed, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. I reached for the bottle, thinking I could put it away, suggest we watch a movie together instead. But as my fingers touched the glass, his hand shot out and caught my wrist. Don't, he said, and his grip was tight enough to hurt. Daniel, you're hurting me, I whispered, but he didn't seem to hear. His eyes were focused on something I couldn't see, something that made him furious. Then his other hand moved, fast and sharp across my cheek. The sound echoed in our kitchen like a gunshot. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my face, more from shock than pain. For a moment, we both just stared at each other. This was Daniel, my Daniel, who cried during sad movies and brought me soup when I was sick, who had promised in front of God and our families to love and protect me. The man standing in front of me, breathing hard with his fists clenched, looked like a stranger wearing my husband's face. He didn't apologize. He didn't rush to comfort me or explain what had happened. He just grabbed the bottle, pushed past me, and walked out the front door, leaving me standing there with my cheek burning and my world tilting off its axis. I don't know how long I stood in that kitchen. Long enough for the dishwater to get cold, long enough for the rain to stop, long enough for the reality of what had just happened to sink into my bones like ice water. My reflection in the kitchen window showed a red mark across my cheek and eyes that looked too wide, too scared. That night, I lay in our bed alone, staring at the ceiling and listening for his car in the driveway. Part of me was terrified he wouldn't come back. Part of me was terrified he would. When I finally heard his key in the lock around 3 a.m, I pretended to be asleep, my whole body rigid under the covers as he stumbled into the bedroom and collapsed beside me without a word. The next morning, Daniel woke up before me and made coffee like nothing had happened. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed for work, buttering toast and humming softly under his breath. When he saw me, he smiled that same gentle smile I'd fallen in love with and kissed my forehead. "Morning, beautiful," he said, handing me a mug with exactly the right amount of cream. "Sleep okay?" I stood there holding the coffee, studying his face for any sign that he remembered what had happened just hours before. But his eyes were clear, his expression open and affectionate. If it weren't for the tender spot on my cheek, I might have thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. "Fine," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. He grabbed his lunch from the counter and his keys from the hook by the door. "I've got parent conferences today, so I'll be late. Don't wait up if you're tired." Another kiss, this one on my lips, quick and familiar. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with my confusion and the lingering smell of his aftershave. For days afterward, he was everything I remembered from our early relationship. Attentive, funny, considerate. He brought me flowers from the grocery store and suggested we try that new Thai place on Division Street. We watched our favorite shows together, and he laughed at all my jokes. I started to convince myself that it had been a one-time thing, a horrible mistake brought on by stress and too much alcohol. But the doubt had planted itself somewhere deep in my chest, a small seed of unease that grew a little each day. I found myself watching him more carefully, looking for signs of anger or frustration. I started paying attention to how much he drank, counting the bottles in our recycling bin. I noticed that he checked his phone more often, that sometimes he didn't answer when I asked about his day. The drinking didn't stop. If anything, it got more systematic. He'd come home from work and immediately pour himself a glass of something, usually wine, but sometimes something stronger. "Long day," he'd say, and I'd nod like it was perfectly normal. By the time we went to bed, he'd had enough to make his words soft around the edges and his movements just slightly unsteady. On weekends, it started earlier. Saturday morning coffee became Saturday morning coffee with Baileys. Sunday brunch included mimosas that turned into Bloody Marys that turned into whatever was in the liquor cabinet. I started making excuses to avoid social gatherings because I never knew which version of Daniel would show up. The worst part was how he'd look at me sometimes when he'd been drinking. Not angry, exactly, but distant, like he was seeing someone else entirely. Someone he didn't particularly like. His jokes became slightly meaner, his compliments backhanded. "You look nice, Em, but maybe try the blue dress instead. That one's getting a little tight." Or, "Dinner was good, but my mom's version had more flavor." Small cuts, each one easy to dismiss on its own. But together they formed a pattern that made me feel like I was shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller, until I wasn't sure who I was anymore. My sister Sarah noticed first. We were having lunch at our usual spot downtown, and she kept staring at me with this concerned expression. "You seem different," she finally said. "Quieter. Are you okay?" I wanted to tell her everything. About the night in the kitchen, about the way Daniel looked at me sometimes, about how I'd started walking on eggshells in my own home. But the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain that your perfect husband, the one everyone loves, is slowly disappearing and being replaced by someone you don't recognize? "Just tired from work," I said instead, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." But Sarah knew me too well to be fooled completely. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? Anything at all." I nodded, but we both knew I wasn't ready to say the words out loud. Not yet. At home, I started spending more time in my office, claiming I had freelance projects to work on. Really, I just needed space to breathe, to remember who I was when Daniel wasn't watching me with those increasingly cold eyes. I'd sit at my computer, pretending to work while listening to his movements in the rest of the house. The clink of ice in a glass, the television turning on and off. Sometimes, if he'd had enough to drink, I'd hear him talking to himself, muttering complaints I couldn't quite make out. The man I'd married, the one who used to bring me coffee in bed and dance with me in the kitchen, was fading like a photograph left in the sun. In his place was someone harder, someone unpredictable, someone who made me feel like I was always doing something wrong even when I couldn't figure out what it was. My mom was the first to say something directly. We were at Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Beaverton, the same dining room where I'd grown up eating my mom's famous meatloaf and arguing with my siblings over who got the last dinner roll. Daniel was in the bathroom, and she leaned over to refill my water glass. "Emma, honey," she said quietly, her voice careful in that way mothers use when they're about to say something you don't want to hear. "Is everything okay with Daniel? He seems different lately." I looked across the table at my dad, who was helping my nephew cut his chicken, and at Sarah, who was telling some story about her coworkers. Everything looked so normal, so safe, that the question felt jarring. "What do you mean different?" Mom glanced toward the hallway where Daniel had disappeared. "He's quieter. And his eyes..." She paused, searching for the right words. "They don't smile anymore even when his mouth does. And you seem nervous around him." "I'm not nervous," I said quickly. But even as the words left my mouth, I realized I was whispering. "He's just been stressed at work. Budget cuts at the school, difficult parents. You know how it is." She nodded, but I could see the worry lines around her eyes deepening. "Just remember, sweetheart, you can always come home, no matter what. Your room is exactly the same." When Daniel returned, sliding back into his chair with that polite smile he wore around my family now, I caught my mom watching him with an expression I'd never seen before. Not dislike exactly, but wariness, like she was seeing something the rest of us had missed. At work, my colleague Janet started asking questions too. We'd been cubicle neighbors for 3 years, sharing coffee and gossip and the occasional birthday cake in the break room. She was the kind of person who noticed everything, from new haircuts to bad moods, and lately she'd been noticing things about me. "You've been wearing a lot of long sleeves lately," she said one Wednesday morning as we waited for the coffee to brew. It was April, and Portland was finally warm enough for short sleeves and sundresses. "Are you cold all the time now?" I looked down at my cardigan, pulled tight around my wrists. Underneath, there were finger-shaped bruises from 2 nights before, when Daniel had grabbed my arm to keep me from walking away during one of his increasingly frequent accusations. He'd been convinced I was flirting with the grocery store clerk, a kid who couldn't have been older than 19. "Just like the layered look," I said, pouring coffee into my mug with hands that shook slightly. Janet studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd raised 4 kids and could spot a lie from across the room. "Emma, if you ever need anything, a place to stay, someone to talk to, whatever, you know where to find me, right?" I nodded, but we both knew I wasn't ready to take her up on the offer. Not yet. The worst part was how good Daniel still was at playing the part when other people were around. At the school's spring fundraiser, he charmed every parent and teacher who came up to our table. "Emma's been so supportive of my career," he told Principal Morrison, his arm around my waist in what looked like affection, but felt like a warning. "I couldn't do this job without her." Mrs. Chen, whose daughter was in Daniel's class, gushed about how lucky I was to have such a dedicated husband. "He stays late every day to help the struggling students," she said, "and he's always talking about how proud he is of you." I smiled and nodded, playing my part perfectly, but I noticed how Daniel's grip tightened when other men talked to me, how his jaw clenched when I laughed at someone else's jokes. By the time we got home that night, I was exhausted from the performance. "You seem to enjoy yourself tonight," he said as we got ready for bed, his tone casual, but with an edge I'd learned to recognize. "It was nice to get out," I replied carefully, hanging up my dress and reaching for pajamas, especially talking to Mark Henderson. You two had a lot to laugh about. Mark was a 5th grade teacher, married with twin boys, who'd told a funny story about a student's creative excuse for missing homework. But in Daniel's voice, our brief conversation sounded like something shameful. "He was just being friendly," I said. "Friendly." Daniel repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Is that what we're calling it now?" That night, he made love to me with an intensity that felt more like claiming than affection. Afterward, as he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I'd started being afraid of my own husband's touch. The lies came easier after that. When Sarah asked about the bruise on my collarbone that I'd tried to hide with concealer, I told her I'd run into the bathroom door in the dark. When my dad noticed that I'd stopped calling as often, I said I'd been busy with work projects. When friends invited us to dinner parties, I made excuses about Daniel's schedule or my own tiredness. I was protecting him, I told myself, protecting us, because admitting what was happening would make it real, and I wasn't ready for it to be real. It was a Sunday in late May when everything fell apart completely. The weather had been beautiful all week, that perfect Pacific Northwest spring where the rain finally stops and everyone in Portland emerges blinking into the sunshine like they've forgotten what warmth feels like. I'd been looking forward to the weekend, maybe suggesting we drive out to the coast or visit one of the farmers' markets we used to love. But Daniel had started drinking before I even woke up. I found him on the couch at 9 a.m. with a beer in his hand, and that look in his eyes that meant the day was already lost. The television was on, some sports show with men yelling about statistics I didn't understand. Empty bottles from the night before sat on the coffee table like evidence of something I didn't want to examine too closely. "Morning," I said carefully, testing the waters. Sometimes he was manageable in the mornings, before the alcohol really took hold. He grunted without looking at me, taking another long pull from his beer. I made coffee quietly, trying not to clink the spoons too loudly or open cabinets too abruptly. I'd learned to move like a mouse in my own home, always listening for changes in his breathing or the tone of his voice that might signal danger. By noon, he'd moved on to whiskey. By 2, he was pacing the living room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath about things I couldn't follow. Something about his principal questioning his lesson plans, about parents complaining about his methods, about how nobody appreciated how hard he worked. I tried to stay out of his way, doing laundry and cleaning the bathroom, anything to keep busy and avoid drawing his attention. But when I mentioned that I wanted to drive to Beaverton to see my parents, everything exploded. "Of course you do," he said, whirling around to face me with that wild look I'd come to dread. "Can't wait to run to Mommy and Daddy, can you? Tell them all about what a terrible husband you have." "I'm not telling them anything," I said, which was true. I'd gotten very good at hiding the truth from everyone, including myself. "I just want to have dinner with my family. You could come too." "Right, so they can all sit around judging me, looking at me like I'm some kind of monster." His voice was getting louder, more slurred, and I could see that vein in his temple that always pulsed when he was getting ready to lose control. "Nobody thinks you're a monster, Daniel. They care about you." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was lost in whatever dark place the alcohol took him to, where everyone was an enemy, and every kindness was a threat. When I moved toward the front door to get my keys, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to make me gasp. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his grip tightening until I could feel my bones grinding together. "You're hurting me," I whispered, but that seemed to make him angrier. "I'm hurting you?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to know what hurt feels like?" His free hand tangled in my hair, yanking my head back so hard that tears sprang to my eyes. Then he was dragging me across the living room, my feet scrambling to keep up, toward the kitchen where this had all started months ago. "Daniel, please," I managed to say, but my voice sounded small and far away, like it was coming from someone else. He shoved me hard against the refrigerator, and I felt something in my shoulder pop. The magnets and photos we'd collected from our travels scattered across the floor. Our wedding picture landed face down by my feet, the glass cracking in a spider web pattern across our smiling faces. "Please what?" he demanded, his face inches from mine. I could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the red veins in his eyes. "Please stop treating my wife like the lying, cheating bitch she is." I tried to protest, to tell him I'd never cheated, never even thought about it, but he backhanded me across the mouth before I could form the words. The taste of blood filled my mouth, metallic and warm. Then he grabbed me by the shoulders and threw me toward the kitchen table. I hit the corner hard, my ribs connecting with the wood in a way that drove all the air from my lungs. The world went gray around the edges, and I found myself on the floor, gasping like a fish out of water. When I tried to get up, his foot connected with my side. Once, twice, a third time, each kick punctuated by words I couldn't process through the roaring in my ears. I curled into a ball, protecting my head with my arms, waiting for it to stop. It might have been minutes or hours later when the kicking stopped. I heard his footsteps moving away, then the sound of the couch springs as he collapsed back into his usual spot. The television volume went up, drowning out my quiet sobs. I lay there on the kitchen floor for a long time, taking inventory of what hurt and what might be broken. My ribs ached with every breath. My mouth was swollen and still bleeding. But worse than the physical pain was the terrible clarity that came with it. This was my life now. This was what I had chosen by staying, by making excuses, by believing that love could fix everything. And if I didn't do something, if I didn't find the courage to save myself, It was only going to get worse. When I finally managed to pull myself up to sitting, Daniel was snoring on the couch, the empty whiskey bottle rolling on the floor beside him. My phone was on the counter where I'd left it that morning, in what felt like another lifetime. My hands shook as I dialed 911, but my voice was steady when the operator answered. "I need help," I said. "My husband just beat me up, and I think he's going to kill me if I stay." The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 officers, a woman named Officer Martinez, and a man whose name I didn't catch, both speaking in calm, professional voices that seemed to come from another world. They found me still sitting on the kitchen floor, holding a dish towel to my split lip, surrounded by the debris of my marriage. Officer Martinez knelt beside me while her partner went to check on Daniel, who was still passed out on the couch. She had kind eyes and spoke to me like I was a person, not a victim, which somehow made everything feel more real. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked, pulling out a small notebook. I told her everything, not just about that afternoon, but about the months leading up to it. The drinking, the verbal abuse, the way he'd isolated me from friends, and made me doubt my own perceptions. Once I started talking, I couldn't stop. All the words I'd been holding back came pouring out like water through a broken dam. They took pictures of my injuries with a camera that seemed too official for something so personal. The flash lit up every bruise, every cut, turning my pain into evidence. Daniel woke up during the photography session, confused and belligerent, demanding to know why there were strangers in his house. Watching them arrest him was surreal. This man I'd loved, whose coffee preferences I knew by heart, whose childhood fears I'd comforted during nightmares, was suddenly a stranger in handcuffs. He looked at me with such hatred as they led him away that I actually flinched. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice carrying clearly across our small living room. "You'll never find anyone who loves you like I do." After they left, the house felt enormous and empty. Sarah arrived within an hour of my call, tears streaming down her face as she helped me pack a bag. She didn't ask questions or offer advice, just held me when I started shaking and couldn't stop. "I should have known," she kept saying. "I should have done something. I didn't want you to know," I told her, and it was the truth. I was ashamed. We drove to her apartment in Southeast Portland, a cozy 1-bedroom with plants everywhere and books stacked on every surface. She made up the couch for me and brought me tea and aspirin, and all the small kindnesses I'd forgotten existed. That first night, I barely slept, jerking awake every time I heard a car door or footsteps in the hallway. The legal process started immediately. Restraining orders and court dates and meetings with prosecutors who explained my options in terms I struggled to understand. Everyone was very kind, very professional, but they all wanted me to make decisions I didn't feel ready to make. Did I want to press charges? Did I feel safe? What did I need to feel protected? I didn't know the answers to any of their questions. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything that made me myself and left only the shell behind. Some days I couldn't stop crying. Other days I felt nothing at all, just numb and disconnected from everything around me. Sarah took time off work to stay with me, bringing me magazines and forcing me to eat when I forgot. My parents drove down from Beaverton every day, my mom bringing containers of soup and my dad just sitting quietly beside me, sometimes holding my hand without saying anything. The hardest part was seeing how much they blamed themselves. "We should have seen the signs," my mom kept saying. "We should have done something sooner." But I was the one who had hidden the truth, who had made excuses and built walls to keep everyone out. I was the one who had chosen to stay silent until staying silent nearly killed me. Therapy started 3 weeks after the arrest. Dr. Peterson was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a gentle voice who specialized in domestic violence survivors. Her office was warm and comfortable, with soft lighting and tissues strategically placed within easy reach. "You're not responsible for what happened to you," she told me during our first session, after I'd spent an hour explaining all the ways I could have prevented it. "Someone else's choice to hurt you is never your fault." It took months for me to believe her. Months of sessions where I picked apart every decision, every moment where I could have left, every sign I should have seen. Slowly, very slowly, I started to understand that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their violence, that protecting myself wasn't selfish or disloyal. Daniel was sentenced to a year in jail and mandatory anger management classes. The restraining order meant he couldn't contact me, couldn't come near me or my family. For the first time in almost 2 years, I could breathe without wondering if he was watching me, judging my every move. I moved into my own apartment after 3 months with Sarah, just a studio in Southeast Portland. But it was mine. I chose the furniture, painted the walls a soft blue that reminded me of happier times, and slowly began to remember who I was before I became someone's victim. The scars are still there, some visible, most not. I still jump sometimes when I hear raised voices or smell whiskey. I still have days when I wonder if I could have saved him, saved us, if I'd been stronger or smarter or more patient. But I'm alive, I'm free, and I'm finally learning that those are gifts worth protecting, no matter what it costs.